We begin our worship service acknowledging that the land on which we meet is the traditional homeland of the Dakota peoples. Seeking to be good relatives, our congregation has committed to ongoing and intentional work with Indigenous peoples to restore relationships and accept responsibility for the work of reparations. Thomas Jefferson will assist me in lighting the chalice, and you will find the words for the chalice lighting on the pew cards. Let us say together the chalice lighting, our UUFM mission statement, as the chalice is lit here in the sanctuary and by those attending on Zoom. Please write in the Zoom chat that a chalice is lit on your street. We are a welcoming people of diverse beliefs who commit to nourish the spirit, broaden the mind, nurture the earth, and build community. May this flame we kindle remind us to strive today and every day to love beyond belief. These next thoughts are from the Soul Matters materials that help us reflect on the October theme of heritage. Ralph Ellison said, "Some people are our relatives, but others are our ancestors. And you choose the ones you want to have as ancestors. You create yourself out of their values." Today we will be visited by one of our UU ancestors, Thomas Jefferson. As Ralph Ellison points out, there is a big difference between relatives and ancestors. Relatives give us our brown eyes and bowed legs. Ancestors bestow a legacy. Relatives are those we tell stories about. Ancestors call us to carry stories forward. Relatives live on in our DNA. Ancestors live in the whispers of our spirits. Our relatives allowed us to be here. Our ancestors tell us why we are here. The difference comes down to values. Values we use to construct not just our stories, but ourselves. Heritage is passed down in the stories we tell. It's even more meaningful when we can hear those stories in the voice of our elders and ancestors. Whereas history pleads, protect what we put into place, heritage urges, know the plot line of which you are a part. History is what happened. Heritage is a story still unfolding. History tends to trap us in tales about what we did, what they did. Heritage inevitably gets us talking about what we are called to do. I would like to invite the children now to come forward, and others who would like to come up to the front and sit on the platform step near President Jefferson. He would like to share some thoughts with you.
So I'm Thomas Jefferson. What do you know about me? Anything? I was president, that's right. And I'm named after the school you go to? That's correct. And when I was president, my grandson, his name was Thomas Jefferson Randolph, but we all called him Jeff. My grandson went away to college at William and Mary, and I wrote a letter to him. I was in the White House at the time, so I had to write a letter to him. I couldn't talk to him. I wrote a letter to him as he was going off to school, and I thought you might want to hear it. My dear Jeff, you are far away from us and alone at school. My advice is to try always to be prudent, and good humor will carry you far. Good humor is the key to getting along. You can see it in politeness. Politeness is really just another form of good humor, and it can make up for it when you aren't feeling the real thing. So politeness means giving to others all the little conveniences and wishes which they would like and which cost us nothing. It's being pleasant to others so they're pleased with us as well as themselves. And it's a cheap price to pay for the goodwill of another. When you're polite in return for a rude thing said by another, it may bring him to his senses. It may correct him in a useful way, and it will show your good nature to others. And since we're talking about how to behave around others, I need to mention another important thing. Never enter into an argument or a dispute with another. I never yet saw a disagreement solved by arguing. Conviction comes from careful reasoning, either in private or listening carefully to what we hear from others. The most good-humored of men, Benjamin Franklin, he had a rule: never contradict anybody. If someone tried to get him to express an opinion, he did it rather by asking a question, as if he needed more information or if he was trying to work through some doubts. When I hear someone express an opinion which I don't share, I say to myself, he has a right to his opinion as I to mine. Why should I argue about it? His error doesn't injure me, and do I think I can make everyone share my opinion by arguing with him? If he has the facts wrong, he's probably happy with it, and I have no right to deprive him of that pleasure. If he wants information, he'll ask for it, and I'll give it politely. But if he still believes his own story and wants to argue with me about it, I'll hear him out and say nothing. It's his affair, not mine, if he prefers error. So, the limits of my paper warn me it's time for me to close with my affectionate adieu. And with that, adieu to you as well.
I understand that you will invite questions from the congregation when you finish your presentation. And when you are ready, I have a microphone to help people ask their questions.
Thank you, Matt. Is this loud enough? Can you hear me? In my time, I was not much for public speaking. My voice was thin. I much preferred to write letters. And so I'll share with you today some of the letters that I wrote at various times. I did write one book. It was called The Notes on the State of Virginia. It was when I was governor of Virginia, the ambassador from France sent a list of 24 questions to the governors of the various new states of the United States so that he might know what each of our states was like. And some of the governors didn't answer at all. Some answered with a sentence or two to each of the queries. I wrote a book. And this was the 17th query was what are the different religions that are received in your state? And I wrote, it is an error that the operations of the mind, as well as the acts of the body, are subject to the coercion of the laws. Our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted. We could not submit. We are answerable for them to our God. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. If it be said his testimony in a court of justice cannot be relied on, reject it then, and let the stigma be on him. Constraint may make him worse by making him a hypocrite, but it will never make him a truer man. It may fix him obstinately in his errors, but it will not cure them. Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them, they will support the true religion by bringing every false one to their tribunal, to the test of their investigation. They are the natural enemies of error, and of error only. It is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. Subject opinion to coercion, whom will you make your inquisitors? Fallible men governed by bad passions, by private as well as public reasons. And why subject it to coercion? To produce uniformity? But is uniformity of opinion desirable? No more than of face or of stature. Introduce a bed of Procrustes then, and as there is danger that the large men may beat the small, make us all of a size by lopping the former and stretching the latter. Difference of opinion is advantageous. Reason and persuasion are the only practicable instruments. I wrote this in 1780. It was published in France in 1785 in French. It was a poor translation, and I didn't like it, so I published it in London in 1787 in English, in my own language. It was the only book I wrote in my time. When I was the ambassador to France, when I was in Paris in 1787, my nephew, Peter Carr, went to the College of William and Mary, and I wrote this letter to him at that time. Dear Peter, I have received your two letters of December 30th and April 18th, and am very happy to find by them, as well as by the letters from Mr. Wyth, that you have been so fortunate as to attract his notice and goodwill. I enclose to you a sketch of the sciences to which I would wish you to apply, in such order as Mr. Wyth shall advise. To this sketch, I will add a few particular observations. Mr. Wyth was one of my mentors when I was at the College of William and Mary before Peter. So firstly, moral philosophy. Man was destined for society. His morality, therefore, was to be formed to this object. He was endowed with a sense of right and wrong merely relative to this. The moral sense, or conscience, is as much a part of man as his leg or arm. It is given to all human beings in a stronger or weaker degree, as force of members is given them in a greater or lesser degree. It may be strengthened by exercise, as may any particular limb of the body. This sense is submitted indeed in some degree to the guidance of reason, but it is a small stock which is required even for this, even less one than what we might call common sense. State a moral case to a plowman and a professor. The former will decide it as well, and often better than the latter, because he has not been led astray by artificial rules. Some of us here have experience with professors and being led. Anyway, in this branch, therefore, read good books, because they will encourage as well as direct your feelings. And above all things, lose no occasion of exercising your dispositions to be grateful, to be generous, to be charitable, to be humane, to be true, just, firm, orderly, courageous, and so on. Consider every act of this kind as an exercise which will strengthen your moral faculties and increase your worth. Regarding religion, your reason is now mature enough to examine this object. Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve of the homage of reason than of blindfolded fear. In fine, I repeat, lay aside all prejudice on both sides, and neither believe nor reject anything because any other person or description of persons have rejected or believed it. Your own reason is the only oracle given you by heaven, and you are answerable, not for the rightness, but for the uprightness of the decision. After I came back from France, I served as Secretary of State under President Washington. I served as Vice President under President John Adams. And then there was a very difficult and contentious election in 1800 in which I defeated John Adams for the presidency. It was an election in which I was called the Antichrist by the partisans of John Adams, and my partisans called John Adams a monocrat, which is to say a monarchist in Democrat clothing. It was a very bruising campaign, and the charge that I was the Antichrist stung. When I was in the White House in 1803, I wrote to Joseph Priestley, the scientist and also Unitarian minister, whom you heard earlier was one of the, Dr. Priestley's sermons were among the few that I happily attended when I was in Philadelphia. And about the same time, I also wrote to Benjamin Rush, who was a physician, founder, he was the Surgeon General of Pennsylvania. So in 1803, I wrote to Mr. Rush, "Dear sir, we were good friends. In some of the delightful conversations with you in the evenings of 1798 and 1799, in other words, when I was running for the presidency, that Christian religion was sometimes our topic. And I then promised you that one day or another I would give you my views of it. They are the result of a life of inquiry and reflection, and are very different from the anti-Christian system imputed to me by those who know nothing of my opinions. To the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the genuine precepts of Jesus himself. I am a Christian, in the only sense in which he wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others, ascribing to himself every human excellence, and believing he never claimed any other. And the result was to arrange in my mind a syllabus or an outline, and in confiding it to you, I know it will not be exposed to the malignant perversions of those who make every word from me a text for new misrepresentations and calumnies. I am moreover averse to the communication of my religious tenets to the public, because it would countenance the presumption of those who have endeavored to draw them before that tribunal, and to seduce public opinion to erect itself into that inquisition over the rights of conscience, which the laws have so justly proscribed." So I shared this with Dr. Rush and with Dr. Priestley. I called it the doctrines of Jesus compared with others. I looked at the Greek and Roman philosophers and said that their precepts relate chiefly to ourselves with government of passions. They fell short when it came to our duties to others. I looked at the teachings of the Jews. Their system of deism, belief in only one God, was correct, but their ethics were imperfect in that they respected only the intercourse with those immediately around them and were antisocial in respect to other nations. And then I looked at the teachings of Jesus. And in my syllabus, I said that his parentage was obscure, his condition poor, his education null, his natural endowments great, his life correct and innocent. He was meek, benevolent, patient, firm, disinterested, and of the sublimest eloquence. He worked under extreme disadvantages. He wrote nothing himself. Those who committed his life and doctrines to writing were unlettered and ignorant, who wrote from memory long after the transactions had passed. And then later, what they wrote was even further disfigured by corruptions of his followers who tacked onto them the mysticism of Plato. And yet, notwithstanding all of this, a system of morals he presents to us which, if filled up in true style and the spirit of the fragments left, would be the most perfect and sublime that has ever been taught by a man. And the essence of his teaching was that he corrected the deism of the Jews, confirming them in the belief of one only God, but giving them a juster notion of his attributes and his government. The moral doctrines relating to kindred and friends was superior to the philosophers or the Jews, in that it extended not only to kin and friends and neighbors and countrymen, but to all mankind, gathering all into one family under the bonds of love, charity, peace, common wants, and common aids. And he also taught the doctrine of a future state, which was either doubted or disbelieved by the Jews, and is an important incentive supplementary to others in morals. So then it was silent. As I had said to Dr. Rush, I did not wish to express my religious beliefs in public, because as I wrote earlier, it's between someone and his God. It's not something that other people, that you should take what other people say. And I did not wish, as president, above all, to express opinions which people would take as coming from the government. After I retired from the presidency, it was not known at the time, but when I was president, one summer in the evenings, I ordered copies of the New Testament in Greek, Latin, French, and English. And I sat at the dining table in the president's house with a pair of scissors, and I cut out passages from each of the Gospels in each of the 4 languages that I felt were specifically things that Jesus said or factual descriptions of what was going on. I left out all of the miracles. I left out all of the Platonic overlays that were in some of the Gospels. And when I came back to Monticello in retirement in 1819, I went back to that work and cleaned it up and assembled it all, pasted it all into a book that I titled "The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth," this book was then passed on to my family afterwards. I'll say more about that in a minute. But so in 1816 was when I did this. I wrote a letter to Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson was the secretary of the Second Continental Congress. He was a Latin scholar and a delegate to the Continental Congress Convention from Pennsylvania, and we were friends. And so I said, "My dear and ancient friend, an acquaintance of 52 years," we were friends before the Continental Convention, "an acquaintance of 52 years calls for an interchange of notice now and then that we remain in existence, the monument of another age, and examples of a friendship unaffected by jarring elements by which we have been surrounded. I'm reminded of this duty by receipt of your synopsis of the 4 evangelists. I too have made a wee little book, which I call The Philosophy of Jesus. It is a paradigm of his doctrines, made by cutting the texts out of the book and arranging them in the pages of a blank book in a certain order of time or subject. A more beautiful or precious morsel of ethics I have never seen. It is a document in proof that I am a real Christian, that is to say, a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus, very different from the Platonists who call me infidel and themselves Christians, and preachers of the gospel, while they draw all their characteristic dogmas from what its author never said nor saw. I went on and closed. Tell me everything about yourself, because all will be interesting to one who retains for you the same constant and affectionate friendship and respect. Your friend, Thomas Jefferson. And then 1822, wrote to Benjamin Waterhouse. He was a Rhode Island physician, founder of the Harvard Medical School. And he was the first, by the way, to test the smallpox vaccine in the United States. Dear Sir, I received and read with thankfulness and pleasure your denunciation of the abuses of tobacco and wine. I did enjoy wine. Yet, however sound in its principles, I expect it will be but a sermon to the wind. You will find it as difficult to inculcate these sanative precepts on the sensualists of the present day as to convince an Athanasian that there is but one God. I wish success to both attempts, and am happy to learn from you that the latter at least is making progress, and the more rapidly in proportion as our Platonizing Christians make more stir and noise about it. The doctrines of Jesus are simple and tend all to the happiness of man. 1, that there is one God, and he is all perfect. 2, that there is a future state of rewards and punishments. And 3, that to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself is the sum of religion. These are the great points on which he endeavored to reform the religion of the Jews. And then finally, toward the very end of my life, 1825, a friend of my neighborhood, Albemarle County, had a son whom he named Thomas Jefferson. The child was Thomas Jefferson Smith. He was about 6 years old when I wrote this. This letter will, to you, be as one from the dead. The writer will be in the grave before you can weigh its counsels. Your affectionate and excellent father has requested that I would address to you something which might possibly have a favorable influence on the course of the life you have to run. And I, too, as a namesake, feel an interest in the course. Few words will be necessary, with good disposition on your part. Adore God. Reverence and cherish your parents. Love your neighbor as yourself, and your country more than yourself. Be just, be true. Murmur not at the ways of providence. So shall the life into which you have entered be the portal to which one of eternal and ineffable bliss. And if to the dead it is permitted to care for things of this world, every action of your life will be under my regard. Farewell. And then I included in this letter to the child the portrait, what I called the portrait of a good man by the most sublime of poets for your imitation. It was Psalm 15 of King David. And then I included a decalogue of canons. A decalogue means 10 commandments for observation and in practical life. First, never put off till tomorrow what you can do today. Second, never trouble another for what you can do for yourself. Third, never spend your money before you have it. Fourth, never buy what you do not want because it is cheap. It will be dear to you. 5, pride costs us more than hunger, thirst, and cold. 6, we never repent of having eaten too little. 7, nothing is troublesome that we do willingly. 8, how much pain have cost us the evils which have never happened. 9, take things always by the smooth handle. And 10, when angry, count 10 before you speak. If very angry, count to 100. So those are some of the things that I had to say about religion and morals. Mostly, I said them in private, with the exception of what I wrote in the notes in the state of Virginia. But they're public now. I made copies of all my letters. But I'd be willing to answer any questions you might have about what I wrote or anything else.
President Jefferson, I know you were a prolific letter writer, and I know you wrote to President Adams for many, many years, yet you've already described this very contentious election that you defeated him. Were you friends or were you enemies?
Yes. At the Second Continental Congress in 1776, the Congress impaneled a committee of 5 to write a declaration to the world of why we were becoming independent. That panel was myself, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Randolph, and Robert Livingston. At that panel, when we first met, Benjamin Franklin said, Thomas, you should write the Declaration, because I had written 2 years before that a summary view of the rights of British America, explaining what I thought the rights of the colonies were in regard to King George and not in regard to the Parliament. And then in 1775, I wrote another pamphlet, Causes and Necessities, laying out why it wasn't going the way it was supposed to. So Franklin said, "You're already primed. You should write this, and we'll edit it." And I said, "No, it should be a New Englander, because as we were meeting in June of 1776, the battles of Concord and Lexington had already been fought, and Boston Harbor was blockaded by the British. And John Adams was the New Englander." And the committee. And John said, "No, Thomas, you should write it. First of all, you're the better writer," which was true. We were both skilled writers, but John had a tendency to go on and on and on. And his second reason was, and besides, you have fewer enemies, which was also true. John was a prickly person. But we got along. We were good friends. When I was ambassador to France, my younger daughter stayed behind. My 2 younger daughters stayed behind. The oldest daughter came with me. The youngest daughter died of whooping cough while I was in France. And so I told the family she was with to send my middle daughter to Paris. I didn't want to risk losing her, too. When she came across the lake, she landed at Dover and spent a month with John and Abigail Adams before I could get out there before I could get away from Paris. And our families were close. But when I came back and served in President Washington's cabinet, the differences between me and John came more to the surface. I believed that, as you heard in my letters, that reason is what should guide the people, and let the people have differences of opinion and let them reason it out. And that differences of opinion are not necessarily bad. And I believe that government belonged with the people. John Adams believed that people needed to be led. They needed a strong leader. Keep in mind, I was a deist, raised what you would call Episcopalian, but not really. My upbringing at William and Mary, I loved the Greek philosophers. I loved Epicurus and the Stoics. John Adams was a New England Calvinist, and people needed a strong leader to tell them what to do. And so we came to loggerheads over what our government should be. Should it have a strong executive, or should our government be the Congress? And should the executive carry out the will of the Congress representing the people, the people's will? Or should the government be, or should the executive be like the King of England, just an elected king? When John Adams became president, he dressed in silks, in court clothes that he had learned to wear when he was ambassador to the court of St. George in London. He wished to be addressed as Your Excellency, and came to the Congress in a gilded carriage drawn by 4 horses. When I was inaugurated, I walked to my inauguration. I wore plain spun brown clothing, and I wished to be addressed as Mr. President. And as a matter of fact, when I received the English ambassador, who came in his silks, to be received at the president's house, and I met him dressed in my bathrobe. He was horrified, and I said, "You want to meet with me? You meet with me." But I'm a man of the people. So that was the difference between us. After I retired from and we did not speak the entire time that I was president. I was in Virginia. I was in Southwest Virginia. He was up in New England, but we didn't correspond either. After I retired, Abigail, who never forgave me for what I did to her husband. She was a fiercely loyal spouse. But Abigail sent me quietly a small note implying that maybe John would like to hear from me. And about the same time, John needed to send something needed to be sent to me, and John was the one who needed to pass it on. And his letter passing it on was ambiguous. I read it as he wanted to hear from me. He didn't intend that at all, but that's how I read it. So I immediately wrote back saying we should not die without explaining ourselves to each other. And that began a 15-year correspondence between us. First talking about what was happening in 1800 in Philadelphia, and then, New York, and then going on more towards thoughts about religion and all sorts of other things. So at the end of our lives, we became friends again. So the answer to your question, it's a long answer, the answer to your question is yes.
President Jefferson, you had such strong respect for the morals and teachings of Jesus. How is it that you could own slaves?
In that same Notes on the State of Virginia, I wrote that as God is just, there is no doubt that these people shall be free. And that I trembled for what will happen to those who hold the slaves, as God is just. And all of my life, I expressed the belief that slavery was wrong. I authored the legislation in the Burgess of Virginia. After the Second Continental Congress, I went back to my country, my state, my country I called it, Virginia, and served in the House of Burgess before becoming governor. And in the House of Burgess, I authored the law that banned the importation of slaves into Virginia. In 1803, I signed the law that banned the importation of slaves into the United States. I wrote, I was constantly looking for a way out, but I couldn't find it. In part because slaves were treated as property and therefore were collateral for the loans that us large farmers needed to take out every year to buy the seed and the fertilizer to run our plantations. And so the banks would not let us. But even if we were wealthy enough, and few of us, after the revolution, few of us were, because for the entire time of the revolution, we couldn't sell any of our produce, but the banks kept charging interest on what we owed. Very few of us were liquid. But aside from that, how do you free, if you were to free someone who has no skills and set them on their own, how will they survive? In a state where if you set them free yourself, anyone in that state can take them and enslave them. I always called them my servants, and I did not permit, I always required that my overseers would treat them as they would treat any hired man. And I had one overseer who didn't, and he fired him. If my servants showed skills, I would train them in what they showed the skill in, and a few of them I did set free because they were able to support themselves, but not many, because I couldn't afford to. So it was a complicated problem. I felt that an individual acting alone would do no good to the individual that they freed. We needed a community solution to the problem, and I was not able to convince the community to do it. When I wrote the Declaration and it went before the Congress, they chopped it up. I thought my version was much better, but the last sentence to be struck from my version of the Declaration was a sentence condemning George for importing slavery into the colonies. And I held out for that to the very end. And South Carolina said, you keep that in, we're not signing. North Carolina said, if South Carolina doesn't sign, we're not signing. And the rest of the delegates said, Thomas, you got to give on this one. I wish I hadn't. Had we not given on that, we would have been a very different country. But I couldn't find a solution.
Mr. President, if you could recommend one or two books that a person should read other than the words of Jesus to help them practice and lead a better life, what would you recommend?
Epicurus, without a doubt, although Epicurus is only in fragments. Marcus Aurelius, Marcus Antoninus, as he was sometimes known, would be another. And actually for morals, novels. The novels of Thomas Stern are wonderful, practical essays into how to lead a good life under difficult circumstances. I would recommend, my wife and I, Martha, one of our favorite books was Tristram Shandy, which we read to each other. You would probably find it a curious book, but it was fun. In fact, to my nephew Peter Carr, I recommended Tristram Shandy to him.
Mr. President, thank you for your answers, and we have time for one more question.
Mr. President, was the Constitution created out of whole cloth, or did you have sources?
I was not part of writing the Constitution. I was in France at the time, although I did correspond extensively with James Madison, offering my advice. James Madison and John Adams both were extraordinary scholars of the philosophy of government from the Greeks and the Romans forward. And they drew heavily on that. We also drew heavily on Locke, John Locke, Treatise on Government. There were many rationalist thinkers that informed what we came up with in the Constitution. And actually the Constitution shows that the Constitution is balancing forces against each other, which is one of the lessons that we learned from the Greeks and the Romans. That if power isn't counterbalanced by another power, the power will become overpowering, which was my objection to John Adams, that the executive needed to be kept in check. We learned that from the Greeks, we learned that from the Romans. When they had republics, their republics fell because eventually a dictator took over. You might take a similar lesson today. But that'd be my answer to that. Our time is short, but I'll also be downstairs if people want to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
German folk song. I'm sure the German common folk enjoyed singing that. So we will extinguish our chalice now, and again, the words are found on the pew card. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.